Hello. Our story continues entrenched in battle. Petulans and Fidelis were fighting for control over one of many battlefields in the galaxy. Men of the rebel force were fighting with their hearts, and those fighting on behalf of the Imperial regime were just throwing troopers into the fray. It had been 5 months since the capture and execution of members within the Senate. The galaxy was stuck in absolute turmoil. The Clone Civil War had ripped through civilizations untouched by the Clone War. Those fighting for their freedom were doing everything within their power to free themselves. The conflict on this world was as grueling as every other battle in the galaxy. They may have been brothers, but the rebels started to become more dissociative when it came to fighting their enemy. They were all clones, but the loyalists had done nothing but disregard them. They carried out executions against their very own former squad mates. They continued this war by simply siding with the less prepared Empire. The Petulans were slowly becoming more and more outnumbered, especially due to the TK troopers that the Empire was flushing into the battlefield. Clones were more elite, but they weren't infinite. And at the end, what the Petulans realized was the most pathetic part about their brothers' failure to listen. Loyalists were being used as cannon fodder, and the TKs tried to clean it up, and it just continued to fail. The tacticians in place for the rebel forces were some of the greatest minds behind the Republic War effort. Those who commanded the Loyalists were Imperial officers, as clones were not permitted to hold command after the rebellion started. It meant that the Loyalist troopers were treated as momentum. They were fed to the belly of the beast, and the TKs came in looking like superficial heroes until they too were killed. In this particular battlefield, across the surface of Kuat, the TKs were perched on a mountaintop, looking down as the blaster fire enveloped the natural beauties of this planet. Cannons unloaded and explosions sent clones on both sides into the air. At the helm of this assault was Commander Cody, and he was going up a lowly academy head from Iridu. The rebels pushed up the hill, avoiding the dense cover of blaster shots that fled down towards them. Cody had taken command over a number of UTAT vehicles. They were designed for unstable terrain, as was in their name, but they were the strength of this assault. Clones used the outskirts of the tree line to slaughter their brothers on the inside, and the tanks fired round after round into their makeshift ramparts. Cody's assault was wide and covered a large area of ground, and the enemy defense was filled up in the middle with multiple ranks in a small area. The Loyalists were certainly a presence, and they outnumbered Cody's unit, not to mention the extra TKs that stood above the hill, but they weren't fighting to their full potential. They were stuck in a small area confined to just ranks of firing. The Fidelis weren't necessarily fighting without morale either. They were fighting for their lives, but their strategy was cutting them off at their knees. Cody stood in the tree line and ordered rockets to be deployed. With the UTATs delivering heavy blows to the ramparts, which were now in shambles, these rockets would douse their defense and fire. Just as these rockets were launched, snow started to litter the field of combat. The plane troopers from both sides would slowly be covered in camouflage, just from the weather alone. Cody's tanks pushed forward, climbing and crushing over trees and the defense line, sending clones on the retreat. The rebels pressed into the defense line of the trees, using the tall and lengthy planes to cover themselves. They, then, without order, fired into the backs of their brothers. All of these rebels had seen the worst of 2 wars, and they were tired of hoping that their brothers could be saved. The brainwashing had caused them all pain, but this was the end of the war, and they would champion themselves as victors. Brothers slaughtered brothers who ran up the hill. What made it all the more ironic was the Imperial officer, who of course wasn't stationed with the first line of defense, who told the TKs to fire into the retreating clones. He reasoned that the Petulans could be wearing Phase 2 armor and trying to trick them. Sadly for the Loyalists, they were not, and thus their ranks were fired upon from 2 different sides. Cries of agony layered the thick air, and the echo of cannons shredded any hope that their final cries could be heard. Cody lined the men up at the edge of the forest and made sure they checked themselves. Rex and Cody were among the greatest commanders in the rebellion, but Cody needed to make sure his brothers were mentally taken care of before making their next push. He and his corporals made sure every clone was ready for the next leg of the assault. While they were checking in, the cannons from the UTATs continued firing. The TKs at the top waited eagerly on their ramparts, while explosions smashed into the side of the hill. They knew the clone traitors would have to ascend the steep side they defended. It would be nearly impossible for a force so small to do this, and the Imperial officer knew it. Cody then radioed across the battlefront to another side, where Hauser was stationed. He and an elite unit of former Republic commandos were making a strike at a power system. Thanks to Delta Squad being saved by the survival of their brother, Sev, the 3 elite troopers joined Hauser on their attack of the power grid. They were bummed over the loss of Scorch, but he had lost himself following Sev's disappearance as it was. He forever blamed the Jedi for abandoning his squad mate, and as the war evolved, he lost much of what made him, him. Boss and Fixer remained close, but they only ever got placed with other units of troopers until the end of the war. Regardless, they broke down the doors of the power structure. Imperial command staff were present, and they were vastly undertrained compared to these 4 clones. A number of blaster shots screeched across the chambers before the clones planted themselves behind the desks and started taking down the defense points across the planet. Kuat was very important for the rebel movement. As the commanders were getting to work, Howitzer got into contact with Saul Guerrera, who was working with Gregor on the far side of the planet, at the ground-to-space terminal. It was a worker station that ferried supplies from the surface to the massive space station over the planet. The clones with Gregor and Saul were essentially making sure that all reinforcements to the space station were stalled. Everyone was in position, which gave Hauser the all-clear. The second the defenses went down, Cody told the men to press the fort. Jet troopers from the remaining 7th Sky Corps leapt into the air. They flew over the base of TKs and fired into their ranks. Some had rockets, others with blasters. The UT-ATs covered the men from the ground as Cody led the charge up the hill. The stormtroopers at the top were completely disorganized, and once they were hit from above, they never saw the attack from below. The elite jet troopers kept the stormtroopers distracted just long enough for the rest of the ground attack to breach the fort. Cody and his men slaughtered the TKs for their treachery. It was an unfair assault, and the clones didn't let up. These were hardened warriors and veterans of 2 wars that never favored them. This was their revenge against the establishment who had wronged them. In space over Kuat, the defense fleet turned around, preparing to return to the surface so they could bombard the rebels. These were unpainted Venators, commanded by more of the same civilians that filled the ground divisions. Just as they were preparing to make their counter, a rebel fleet deployed from hyperspace. In command of it were more clones, and they unloaded their cannons into the back of the Loyalist defense fleet. Due to the lack of numbers in the petulant ranks, they employed a variety of astromechs to fill the bridge. The clones weren't thrilled about this, but they needed their best pilots in the air, not behind the bridge of the Venator. So quite a few astromech facilities were raided prior to the assault on Kuat. The Imperial Defense Fleet, caught absolutely flat-footed, tried to make a push for the surface, but rebel bombers were able to cut through their shield generators and make a target on their engines, which would destabilize the small defense fleet, just inside Kuat's gravitational pull. It would be the death of hundreds of clones and Imperials, and it would be the end of Kuat's small defense, and the rebel fleet would dock with the space station, giving them a chance to force the Imperials inside to surrender. Just below, Saw and Gregor slaughtered TKs who tried to make a run for the space station. The civilians were given the option to join their cause or surrender. Most of them joined, because the Petulants had proven themselves heroes of the Civil War. It had been nearly a year since the fall of the Republic, and while the Empire tried to respond appropriately to this rebellion, they couldn't really. It caught them completely flat-footed as well. It was a weird thing with timing. Had this rebellion waited more than a couple months, it would have been silenced rather rapidly. And that was perhaps the greatest sacrifice of Thrax's life. He jump-started a movement that would have failed pretty quickly if it had started any later. The clones, regardless of this, were flying high. Every battle they fought in was a mismatch. Imperials saw the mismatch in numbers. The rebels saw it as a mismatch in skill, which it was. Rebel leadership, under a variety of great clone commanders of the previous war, was motivating and unbreakable. They pushed their men harder than ever before. The clones responded well to the adversity they faced. A major help to the clone movement was the quiet support of a number of former neutral system worlds and separatist worlds. The separatist worlds sympathized with the rebel movement because they used to be the rebels. There was also the major boost of morale that came after their previous attack at Coruscant. The clones were still stationed there, fighting off whatever the Emperor sent their way, but the Senate absolutely changed following the group execution. It made a point to the Senate that their voices had value, and the clones needed it more than ever. So most of the senators executed were replaced with pro-clone representatives. This aided the clones greatly because they were able to, with their limited power, reduce the military spending of the Imperial budget. Sidious had a lot of credits from the deconstructed conglomerates he took over after the Clone War, so he was able to still fund the military, but the majority of the Senate budget went to reconstruction efforts, which was the silent way of saying they supported the clones. The Imperial military since the group execution had won some conflicts, but mostly they were outmatched in every engagement based on skill. They outnumbered the rebels due to the fact that the clones couldn't replenish their lines, but they also allowed that overconfidence to best them. All the rebels knew that they were outnumbered, which is why they played very conservative attacks. They understood that to win a battle wasn't as important as winning the war. Imperial officers were also highly crippling for the Empire, because they got a number of talented clone commanders killed. Baccarat is one of the many who lost their lives to faulty orders, but in reality to the Empire, it was never about giving good direction, because to them, the clones were just as expendable as battle droids. At the end of the day, officers under Tarkin's command knew two things. Firstly, that the clones were more elite than stormtroopers, but secondly, that they could use these clones to thin the lines of their brothers, the ones that were rebels. What they hadn't anticipated was the reaction the petulants would have. The rebels didn't just buckle when they killed their brothers, they became angrier, because they knew exactly what was happening. They were now putting their brothers out of their misery, freeing them from their enslavement. This was a holy war in their eyes, not one out of political control, which is why the clones were so successful. To those who watched from the outside, especially those who sided with the petulants, it was clear that they were in this for more than themselves. Realistically, that wasn't really the truth, but they were fighting like men possessed by the will of the gods. They were fearless and unbroken. The trials of the Clone War were just a footnote in their presence on the galactic map. The Imperials believed that they could just throw clones at clones and expect to win, and instead they diminished their numbers in combat. Their own war veterans were mutinying or straight up dying. Every failed battle for the Empire had thousands of clones dying, and those who survived saw why their brothers had betrayed the military. Conscriptions brought into the Imperial regime would eventually outnumber the clones, but their lack of skill made their numbers less daunting. Though another expected twist in this clone civil war was the rise of rebel movements. This was especially present on former CIS worlds. As a part of their integration into the Empire, they were forced under Imperial control. Some of them, based on good behavior, got to have representatives within the Senate. All of these systems, though, were against the Empire, so whether or not they had representation, it didn't matter. If they had a senator or representative, then they were fighting within the Galactic Senate. If they were punished with martial law and curfews, then they gifted the Empire their warriors, not in the good way. A number of CIS planets had militias created in case the battle droids went awry, and now these militias vanished, most of them overnight. Unlike the Imperial regime, these rebels served under the clones. And while that was difficult for individuals like Saw Gerrera, he had great respect for the man who helped him and his people free Onderon. Commander Rex was the face of this movement, and he kept the troopers united. He made sure the clones trained others if they wanted, not by mandate. This created a natural brother and sister relation between the sentient rebels and the petulants. They were united in the common goal of defeating the Empire, and this was only enforced more when Sidious released his temperamental student on the galaxy. Darth Vader's activation wasn't in hunting down the Jedi, it was destroying the clones. The issue is, their attacks were sporadic, so when Cody's boys struck Kuat, Vader was out on Sullust chasing ghosts. In his first battle, one of the few Imperial victories, he slaughtered the clones. After the second battle, the rebels realized that they needed to isolate Vader. Once they did that, they could continue to win. So Rex devised the Ghost Initiative, which used Saw Gerrera tactics to fuel guerrilla warfare on industrial worlds. They made targets out of plants, shipyards, armories, and so forth. The Imperials then loaded up on defending those locations, but it eventually fell out of control because the clones never hit them. They'd give 2 targets and hit one where Vader wasn't. It was a powerful device to isolate the Empire's strongest warrior, which meant that for the Jedi, they could go into hiding and regroup. Jocasta Nu was among many survivors who saved a number of younglings and brought them to her cache. The Jedi were still in vast numbers, and they actually, surprisingly, grew following the Civil War. The main reason for this growth came from Inquisitors who betrayed the Empire. They joined the Empire to survive. Then Sidious threw these Inquisitors at the clone armies. These were individuals who had killed off the entire Jedi Order, and now they were going to fight 2 Inquisitors at a time? Two individuals unsure of their own abilities and what they were going to do? They were fighting light and dark within themselves, trying to kill clones they'd grown up respecting. So whenever an Inquisitor showed themselves, they either died or retreated into the shadows, using it as an opportunity to disappear, and even eventually join the other Jedi. Outside of ground operations, the Petulants had done a fine job at maintaining their navy. The Imperial regime had their Star Destroyers, which is why Cody was designated to attack Kuat, but these Star Destroyers were few. They showed up, sure, but the experience of opposing clone gunners and pilots made sure the Star Destroyers weren't effective. This wasn't to say the clones won all their engagements with the far larger and technologically superior Star Destroyers, but they did make a mark. Most of the time, clones would do bombing runs on their hangars and shields before abandoning the system. Their main objective was to cripple the new tech and force the TKs to fix it. The clones, as said earlier, raided a multitude of astromech assembly lines and took as many as they could, reprogramming them for space combat, and unloading recordings of Clone War combat into their mainframes. The clones maintained their position on avoiding conflict, so that they could win this war, though their tactics weren't quite hit or run. They only did that if they got caught off guard, which did happen sometimes, but most of their fights were straight up brawls. Of course, one thing that really hurt both sides were spies, but the rebels did a much better job at siphoning through potential traitors. Due to how free the Petulants were, it was kind of easy to pick out a spy based on their dialect alone. Some of these traitors would be blasted out of airlocks, because it was a better fate than being enslaved by Imperial officers. The Empire struggled because all a clone needed to do was act like a battle droid. The personality of the Imperial clone core was dead. It was silent and still. There was no life, and the clones who spied on the Empire were able to act all the same. Though something that became an unprecedented hero of this movement was the Brotherhood. There was, of course, the unity that was previously touched on regarding the clones and their rebel allies. They were a tight band of brothers and sisters, fighting against the Imperial regime, but for the clones themselves, they were tighter than ever before. The Brotherhood that filled the Petulant ranks was unmatched in galactic history. They had fought 2 wars, turned on their brothers, and now they were on the cusp of winning again, but this time on their own terms. They were united in this holy war against the Empire, and the more they won, the closer they got. The clones were true heroes of the galaxy, inspiring and cultivating the minds of civilians to join their cause. People who were complacent under the cloud of the Clone War were rising up to take the throne of the galaxy for themselves. It wasn't any one person that should hold that throne, because the people of the galaxy wanted a return to what they were, to what they deserved, and more than anything, they were fighting this war for the clones. Out on Sullust, though, Vader sat quietly and breathed. He scanned the dark planet he stood on, and thought about this campaign. His eyes closed and remembered holding a clone by the throat above his torso, and cutting another down. Vader came down from the moment, and remembered Cody telling him about one of his many encounters with General Grievous during the war. Anakin was inquiring because he wanted to instruct his troopers of what to do if they saw General Grievous. The instruction was simple: keep your distance. Vader was no different than the technological creature that slaughtered the clones before. But he couldn't just feel bad. They were traitors. They were the traitors. Anakin's mind revolved in circles, trying to find an answer for why he was willingly doing this. He was a hero of the Republic, general of his brothers, and now he slaughtered them when he saw them. Among the victors, Vader was responsible for 5 out of 7 Imperial victories in the last several months. This was specifically for large battles, not for skirmishes, which the clone rebels had significantly more wins in anyways. Vader felt regret, something he tried to get rid of since Order 66. All of his pain and suffering since losing to Obi-Wan was perpetuated by Sidious. He knew it, but he was powerless against it. That perhaps was the most disarming aspect of this imprisonment inside of his suit. He couldn't say anything against the Emperor, and he was simply acting as an enforcer. Truthfully speaking, though, Vader had his reservations about serving the Emperor. He felt like he was betraying his true self, because he held nothing against the clones. Sure, you had a clique here or there, or a fox, but nothing that outright had them deserving of this punishment. Obviously, the same could be said regarding the Jedi, but that wasn't the point. Vader's suffering was only amplified by a slaughter of those he once considered brothers. He cared deeply for the men of the clone army, and killing them instead of Jedi, for example, was leading him to be spiteful of Sidious. In the scenario where he was sent to hunt down the last of the Jedi, he would have felt some sense of purpose, but he didn't care about the Empire. He didn't care about the TK troopers. He didn't seek revenge on the clones. There was nothing in this fight for him. At least with the Jedi, he would have felt vindicated due to his loathing of the Order, for his belief that they had wronged him and his wife. But with the clones, he felt nothing but regret. Months of sieges would follow the victory at Kuat. After destabilizing the most important shipyard in the Empire, people started to buy the idea of a clone victory. The Petulants continued to get doubted because they were a rebellion, but their sound strategies had kept them safe. However, being that it had been another entire year of continuous galactic-scale war by this point, the galaxy wasn't nearly as accepting as the clones would hope they would be. They had found victory, but they were truly standing against the Empire. But they also couldn't fully remove themselves from the view that the public had taken of them. The issue for the Petulants continued to be their lack of control. They couldn't just dedicate members of their military to any given planet or system. Borovia was continuously a safe location for the clones to hide at, but aside from that, they had to abandon every planet they captured. Sadly, one of the many clone commanders felt the wrath of Vader when they stayed behind to hold the ground. It wasn't a terrible loss, but around 1,200 men stationed to defend the planet were lost. Kuat was destabilized, so the actual shipyards weren't able to be used, leaving the regime to focus on more suitable locations, many of which had already been hit. This left the war in a stalemate, something Sidious was eagerly waiting for. He was disappointed with Vader's production because it was relatively underwhelming in his eyes, but he knew that eventually the clones would run out of steam. Sidious was very frustrated because the clones fighting on behalf of the Empire were mostly dead. The clones had been used as cannon fodder so that the TKs could get trained up and be prepared for the actual war, but things were so bad that people within the Imperial military were actively mutinying because the clones were demons. Like, these were completely unhinged warriors. The Petulants weren't just petulant anymore, they were hardened killers. They had seen the worst of two wars, faced the evil of the galaxy twice, and slaughtered their own flesh and blood. These troopers wanted their freedom and they couldn't get a grip on it, because they weren't permitted the chance to do so. Thus, once most of the loyalist clones of the Imperial regime were mostly free from the battlefront, the rebels made their war effort even more terrifying. Their clone armor donned not paint, but the blood of their enemies. The troopers of the former Grand Army of the Republic were barbarians, a rebel movement that needed to be quelled, and the only hope for stopping it was perhaps the best chance at a rebel victory. Across the stars inside the Inner Rim at Thifera, Vader fought off dozens of clone troopers. Another perilous attack had TKs running in confusion. They didn't have the grit to defend themselves, because they were truly underprepared for the war that faced them. The troopers of the Imperial military were running in different directions, getting gutted by Vibroblades and facing the ultimate wrath of the clone rebels. Vader happened to be on the planet, after being led astray by another phantom force. It was an accidental mess-up, one that would cause plenty of clones great pain. Vader was brought in and tried rallying the fighting men of the TK Corps, but they refused to form a line, so the Sith apprentice blocked strikes from the clones, and cut down whoever came within range of him. The TK saw this and decided to continue running, because why not? Vader would save them, and he was getting frustrated. Vader was dispatching the clones relatively easily, before creating a complete disruption in their assault. The clone leadership before this battle agreed to stall assaults if they ever ran into Vader, so that they could maintain their ranks. So that's what this unit did. They continued to shell the Imperial fortifications, but they retreated with all their men, leaving Vader in the middle of a battlefield with no support. He looked down at a saber where the body of a clone trooper limply fell off of it, their breath wheezing out under the smoke of battle. The Sith apprentice felt regret. All the instructions he had been taught fell deaf on him in this moment. He wasn't where he was supposed to be, and he looked at the clone ramparts in the tree line. The only identifiable aspect of the defense was the cannon fire that erupted every few seconds. The blue bursts of light revealed cannons, but not troop numbers. He watched explosions detonate around him. Surely he could win it by himself, but where was the honor in doing that? His helmet turned around as another blast ripped past his armor, shredding his robes and smashing into the ground behind him. Two words crossed his mind: no more, as he rolled his body fully towards the Imperial base and marched on it. The TKs, now in a defensible position, rallied to their walls and prepared to cover Vader, but this would be their final test of strength. Once he entered the base, bodies dropped by way of the Force, before Vader's lightsaber was slung through their bodies. Artillery fire continued to pour over the walls and blow stormtroopers up inside the fort, but Vader was untouched. He slung his saber through bodies. TKs could be heard crying out in terror from the other side of the battlefield. The clones could see it with their long-range viewfinders. Vader avoided blasts at his head and ripped through bodies. These pathetic little rats thought that they could save themselves. They had only certified their own doom. Vader ran his weapon through every single last Imperial inside the base. The clones on the other side of the battlefield watched it like it was in slow motion. The red saber bobbed around, limbs flew from bodies, multiple individuals were killed at once, some were even lifted from their feet and slaughtered. It was an impossible show of strength, and they didn't need to do anything. Vader, following his massacre, would raise a white banner and welcome the clones into the base, where he would offer his terms of surrender and recruitment into their ranks. He wished to serve the right side of history, and he could do that with them. The clones were worried of his intentions, but he remained honest with them and told them that he too had been enslaved by the Emperor. In watching their fight for freedom, he realized his own entrapment and wished to assist in the liberation of the galaxy. It was the right thing to do, and he wished to participate in their efforts for the people. After several hours of deliberations, he would be approached by Captain Rex, who was in the fleet overhead, conducting protection exercises for the planet and assisting with multiple assaults on various battlefronts from afar. Rex had taken on the role of general for the Great Army, as it was being referred to nowadays. When he landed, Vader and Rex walked away from the former Imperial base and discussed everything. He didn't know how this happened to Anakin, but Rex was already familiar with his actions at the temple. Truthfully speaking, Rex was very untrusting of Vader, because he had betrayed himself. If he wanted to be of any assistance, then he would accompany Howitzer and Delta Squad on an important mission to Hosnian Prime. They were going to loot the Imperial reserves, which had been removed from Scipio and placed on Hosnian. If he could appropriately assist the clones, then he would have his trust. If not, then he was as dead to him as the Jedi Order he helped destroy. Rex knew where Ahsoka was, but he wasn't going to put the burden of Skywalker's actions on her, and he told Vader that. He never even referred to Anakin by his name, only by the monstrosity he had become. Because at the end of the day, Skywalker had slaughtered younglings, and he had also killed Rex's brother in their quest for freedom. This wasn't the same commander that fought battle droids during the Clone War. This was a man hanging on by a fingertip. Insanity was lurking over his shoulders, and his desire for freedom outweighed every concern he had in the galaxy. Vader would respond to the criticism of character well, and he would do as was instructed, because while he didn't like the tone that Rex gave him, Rex was right. Anakin had made terrible mistakes, and he had single-handedly stalled the rebel effort numerous times. If he wanted to prove himself, he would help the clones with this imperative mission. It would go relatively easily, and Vader would kill off the final Inquisitors inside the reserve building. The structure wasn't even a finished construction yet, but it was a very brutal fight for some of the underprepared former Jedi. The Squad of 5 did everything they needed to do, emptying out the pockets of Imperial elites and stealing every ounce of credits out of Imperial banks. The funny thing is, the clones couldn't do much with the credits they stole. They would use it to pay back formerly CIS worlds that had assisted them with supplies, which were mostly food. But mostly, they would hold on to the credits, as the Empire bankrupted itself, and they really hoped that the collective people would turn on Palpatine as a result, which is why they went after it. It was weird for the people of the galaxy. They continued to bounce back and forth between supporting the clones and not, because the clones were technically fighting against them, but they also didn't seem very interested in subjugating anyone to slavery or putting them in cages. The clones just wanted their freedom, and the warmonger himself couldn't stop fighting them. This could have all ended had Palpatine just paid the clones off and let them be, but no, he needed to challenge them and get revenge. So all of a sudden, the patriotism that brought an elected official to the power of Emperor slowly diminished. Vader, once earning the trust of the clones, was brought back to the galactic stage for more combat. He'd be joining Rex on the front lines, where he would see the shock of what had become of his own troopers. None of the former legions were all together. Most of them were split up, with various members serving with each other. So Rex's unit wasn't just 501st troopers, it was all mixed. Regardless, Vader saw the violence of these clones in action in his first battle with them. He hadn't really seen this intensity, because he never encountered it personally. All of his battles were surprise attacks on unsuspecting clones. And sure, he saw the aftermath of some of it, but never really thought about how vile the clones needed to be to achieve such destruction. Vader also learned about the inhibitor chips. While battles were a necessity for the clones, which they mostly won, another key to their victories was their freedom. When the war was between two different sides of the clone army, they could afford to keep their chips. But once the threat of turning his own clones against him diminished, Sidious tried getting into the heads of the Petulans. The issue is, by that point, every clone in the rebel movement had removed their inhibitor chips. They were never the reason why these clones betrayed the Empire, but the Kaminoans made sure they protected the clones, who kept their entire species alive on Borovio. Regardless of which, the war against the Empire was a war against Sidious, and the people, now losing their economy due to having absolutely no money in circulation, needed an answer. Coruscant completely locked itself down, meaning that the clones inside of it were trapped. But this also meant that the Emperor, who was stationed on Nur, wasn't going anywhere, especially not the capital. The literal heart of the galaxy was locked down, and the local politics of Coruscant isolated themselves from the rest of the galaxy. They made amends with the clones on planet, and stationed a fleet over it to keep everyone out. Without completely hiding themselves like the people of At-Aten, they just locked themselves down. No one could leave or exit, and the governmental officials did this so that their economy didn't collapse under the pressure of the Imperial Reserve being stolen. Every other world politician was released, and the oligarchs on planet had to give up some of their credits to keep circulation stable. It wasn't the most stable decision, but it would save them from an all-out recession that smashed the rest of Imperial-occupied territory. Because the rebels were sending credits to former CIS worlds, they were able to boost themselves and align with the Clone War allies. In Rex's mind, and many clones, there were no bad feelings towards each other. The CIS wanted freedom from the Republic, and the clones happened to serve it. They didn't have anything against the clones per se, which is why this alliance was able to prosper. With Sidious's coordinates given away by Vader, a clone fleet under Rex's command departed for Nur. The rebel forces wouldn't need to worry about much when it came to finding and fighting the Emperor. The small fleet over the planet was under the control of Tarkin, and it was the last thing standing in the clones' way. The rebels started the assault with a little twist. Everyone within their ranks could sense the changing tides. This was not because of Vader, but his decision to betray the Empire was the first indication that their enemy was about to crumble. The Imperial war effort was weak and fragile, and without the hunger that drove the clones, there was no fight. Most of these TKs signed up to serve their Emperor, but Palpatine rarely showed himself anymore, and when he did, he was begging for new recruits. So most of these new troopers had very little morale, and their honor was shot, not to mention the absolute terror that was their opponent. The clones terrified these people. And so, on the cusp of what they hoped to be their final victory, 5 units of clones deployed at 5 different locations, one after another. Thousands of clones deployed into hostile territory and attacked. Of course, Tarkin was informed of these developments from Nur. The troopers inside of its fleet realized that this was the end. Some of them vying for a mutiny, others just in disbelief, silently waiting for the end. 5 battles on 5 different planets, all swinging towards rebel victory, and then the fleet deployed. Rex's fleet still being controlled by a majority of astromechs dropped out of hyperspace. 4 Venators and several support craft. They had pilots from a variety of planets, but they all got into formation behind Vader, who squeezed himself into a Jedi Edda-class starfighter. It wasn't comfortable, but he made it work. The 3 Star Destroyers over Nur activated their shields, and didn't fire back. Their crews were rushing for their hangar bays. There were a couple cannon shots, but mostly it was silent. The clones were ordered to take no prisoners, and thus, Tarkin stood on his bridge, holding onto the command console at the front of the viewport, and watching his Imperial dream implode in his face. He was hopeful it wouldn't come to an end like this, but there wasn't hope for any other reality. There were a few fighters that tried to fight back, but anything with a hyperdrive fled the hangar bays and departed into hyperspace before the rebels could destroy them. Without being challenged, the fighters then led a bombing strike on the fortress of Nur. Sidious was at the top of it, conducting a ritual when a torpedo launched by Vader himself crushed him and destroyed the tip of the building. More bombs were laid into the structure, crumbling the support down on the rest of it. Thousands of TK troopers would be left to drown, suffocating under the weight of the waves that covered Nur's surface. Outside of the atmosphere, Rex's fleet broadsided the destroyers, 2 on each side, the flagship and her support ships lining up and unloading full broadsides. and Tarkin's ship fired not a single shot. He just stared blankly at the reaches of space before him and spoke quietly to himself. It was just good business. He had done this to the clones, and now they were repaying him a favor. The few who abandoned ship would never fight for the Empire again. In a weird way, following these 6 battles, including the proclaimed death of Palpatine, the Empire didn't react. They just watched in awe. They were built up by the clones and taken down by the clones in less time than the clones spent in the Clone War, and they did it with half the force. Take a shot every time I say clones in one sentence. There were still pockets of resistance, but the TKs went home, hanging up their gear and trying to forget the trauma they had faced. The final battle of the war would come with another Rex and Vader masterclass at Anaxis. The Empire gathered their forces up for one last defense, and before they could even move out for an attack, they were blindsided from multiple directions. Similar to the attack at Nur, Vader led an expert attack with fighter forces, and it crippled the defenses of the space fleet. On the surface, Rex and Vader fought side by side, like they had before, and ended the conflict with an unstoppable assault. What followed Nur, prior to the Battle of Anaxis, was the changing of the guard. The entire Imperial Reserve was given over to a new coalition of systems called the Confederacy of Galactic Systems. The CGS included the likes of Raxus, Mandalore, Ryloth, Christophsis, and Sereno as frontline planets, or in other words, powerhouse systems that carried a large sum of wealth for the movement. This came from the economic support these systems gave to the clones prior to their capture of the Imperial Reserve. Mandalore didn't give troopers, by the way, but it was a staging ground for wounded men to be healed, mostly out on Concordia to keep the capital safe. But this was the building blocks for the new galactic civilization. Those militias and rebels that served with the clones would be formed into an official military, but most rebels, without having enough pay to keep them interested, would go back home after they won. The clones were given complete freedom, they were given sanctuary cities to stay at, and they were honored for their dedication to bringing peace to the galaxy, even if it was against the CIS at one point. This coalition unified different parts of the former Republic and former Confederacy. It completely redrew the map of the galaxy, as several planets from different sects didn't want to be a part of it, but they would eventually fall in line, because unlike the still shut down Coruscant, these systems couldn't self-sustain without alliance. Coruscant, on the other hand, would remain an island in the galaxy for decades, and it would release the clones who made peace with them, if they wished to leave. Aside from that though, it would be one of the strictest locations in the galaxy, and mostly forgotten about. Those who left Coruscant weren't really liked anyways, so they just remained isolated. The CGS would welcome in survivors of the Clone Civil War, and give former Imperials a chance to find a new way of life after the war. They were treated kindly, and this set the CGS apart from the Republic and the Empire. Their kindness translated into a positive galactic community that accepted rather than rejected. There would be several growing pains because it was a difficult time for the galaxy. The clones had made a mess of it twice, and the CGS was willing to cover all of it. This was kind of because the clones technically bribed them, but also because there was no point in harboring revenge. These people had been through so much, and the former CIS actually valued the sentience of the clones. They were tormented, and it was time for them to be free. Also, the clones did what they couldn't do with millions more battle droids: win a war. Vader, like the clones, would find freedom in his own ways. Once he abandoned the Sith path, he would become a hermit. He would never see Obi-Wan again in his life, but that didn't make him a miserable person. Anakin eventually returned, and he traveled the galaxy, seeing the stars and even settling down and starting a new family. He wouldn't forgive himself for what happened to Padme, but because he never learned of Luke or Leia, he would be forced to start again. In his new relationship, he would find peace and happiness, and have a new family with many children. Most of the life he had before the Civil War would be forgotten to time. His new family, though, was all he needed. Anakin would keep in contact with Rex, but it took Ahsoka a really long time to eventually come around, especially after she had found out what he had done. They too would make amends, but they'd be separated for a long time. On the other side of things, Ahsoka would meet with Maul again, but his little criminal empire would never grow to galactic scale size. The CGS hindered growth for the syndicates, but Maul wouldn't face the wrath of a galactic military. The Jedi would rebuild, having not been targeted by the Empire. They were able to gather, giving dozens of Jedi the chance to find unity in their brothers and sisters. Jocasta Nu would be the future Grand Master, and she would resurrect the Order. Rex and the boys would find various paths to enjoyment in life, but none greater than the cure the Kaminoans gave them. Despite losing Kamino to Imperial occupation after Order 66, and even losing new batches due to Tapoka City being sunk by Vice Admiral Rampart after the Clone Civil War started, the Kaminoans made their peace with their creations. Throughout the war, and in the year following its completion, Nala Se and her scientists created a cure for the clone aging problem. It would spare every single member of the former Grand Army of their sped-up lives. They would lose their accelerated aging, and they'd be able to live out their lives normally. It was their time to have a life worth living, and most clones would be able to live out long past their 80s, so that they could see what kind of positive effect they had on the galaxy. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to the patrons: Manuel Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Alexandra Reese, The Beginning and End, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Smoobs, There Are Cars, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot 36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Django Fett Clone, Nick 5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pyramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo Weewo 670, Annika Stink Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngling Slayer 66, Man Manu Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Ford's Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Man of Three First Names, Darksling 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. Voice Point channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So the Clone Civil War. This is like a dark story. Like, it's a very vile, dark story. This for the clone rebels is like them slowly descending into madness and eventually getting their accolades, but like the trauma of what these two wars would do to them is just unimaginable. They've been through so much, and in this story they have to kill their own brothers, and they basically put the entire other side out of life. Like, they just kill everybody, and they're just losing their mind rapidly. As I said in the story, I think this clone rebellion and this clone civil war wouldn't work if they waited much longer. There's a reason why this particular effort works, and it works because it happens to take place like a month after Order 66. If they had waited for, say, 3 months, 6 months, a year, as long as it does in the Bad Batch, it wouldn't work like it does in canon. It just wouldn't come together. Now, there are millions of clones. I think there's like 2 or 3 million clones, so I kind of just split that down the middle and said like half is half. So that's why the clones are able to hold out for so long. And the Empire just isn't really prepared for war. They're trying to phase out, they're trying to implement new systems, and they just don't really have it together to face the wrath of another war. And I think Sidious would be a bit cocky in this. I think he'd be a little bit in his head, be like, oh yeah, we can win this. The TKs will just be enough to finish it off, and then they wouldn't, and he'd be surprised. I'm not saying that he wouldn't try and execute Order whatever, but by the time he tried, it would already be too late. So, I hope you all enjoyed. Vader got a little redemption, he got a little happy family aside from Luke and Leia. I thought that'd be a different path to go for him. But I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.